search the scriptures, as Christ our God said in the Gospels. For in them
Welcome, brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live, where we interpret the Bible according to the mind and the writings of the early church. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today's date is March 17th, 2025, St. Patrick's Day. Chronia Pola, many years to all of you who have the name Patrick or Patricia. This is lesson 109 on the Gospel of Matthew. And if you wish to join us live tonight with your comments or questions, you can call into the program by calling 855-237-2346, 855-AF Radio. Tonight, we're talking about the Jewish trial of the Lord before the great Sanhedrin and Peter's denials that follow after that. But first, let's begin with our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, tonight we're getting really into the heart of the Passion, beginning with the Jewish trial of the Lord. I say the Jewish trial because he had two trials. There was a Jewish trial and there was a Roman trial, which we will discuss next week. Now, there's a lot of information that we're going to go through tonight, historical information about the Jewish trial. And if you want all of those details without furiously taking notes on this program, it is all in my book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, that was published by Ancient Faith Publishing. It is available at store.ancientfaith.com, but also on Amazon and every other place. We do encourage you to get your books that are published by Ancient Faith at store.ancientfaith.com, because that's supporting the ministry of Ancient Faith Radio. Now, there's something else I want to bring up for 30 seconds, that this book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, was also translated into Romanian, and by the way, also into Korean. I have no idea how to get copies of those. I know they're available in Korea and in Romania, but it's also available in the Greek language. And I'm bringing this up because this was published by a monastery in Cyprus, and they would like to be able to sell it in Canada and the United States, but they don't know who will carry it. They approached a monastery here in the United States that declined to have it in their bookstore for whatever reason, their space or whatever. But if you know of a monastery in the United States, I'd like one in the United States and one in Canada that would carry this book, it's much easier for Greek speakers to order it from a location in the United States or Canada, because it costs so much more to get a book from Europe. So if you know of a monastery that would carry this book, that attracts Greek worshipers, people who speak Greek, because this one is available everywhere in English. But I'm talking about the Greek translation specifically. Please do let me know. You can write to me at Dr. Jeannie at drjeannie.com, or Dr. Jeannie, DRJEANNIESTS, for Search the Scriptures, at gmail.com. So thanks for allowing me to make that appeal out there, because otherwise I don't know how to get the word out. So in our last program, the Lord was arrested, and now he's being taken to the home of Caiaphas for the trial. So let's begin by reading. This is Matthew chapter 26. Let's begin by reading verse 57 of chapter 26. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered. But Peter followed at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. That's a little sort of secondary story about Peter and his denials, and we're going to talk about that toward the end. Each of the evangelists present the denials. They all have the denials of St. Peter, but they present them in a slightly different manner. Some of them are kind of interspersed with the trial, and which is probably how it happened. And then Matthew has it pretty much all at the end. And it's very interesting. Of course, John has more details about how he got into the courtyard, but Peter was left outside, and he had to get the maid at the door to let Peter in, and all the rest. This house, this is the house of Caiaphas, who is a historical figure, very important high priest of the first century in Jerusalem. His tomb was discovered just a few years ago, and the location of this place where the trial took place, the house of Caiaphas, has been known for hundreds of years because Saint Helen built a church on that spot when she was in the Holy Land, building churches on at various places where important events of the life of the Lord took place. That was St. Helen who did that, identified this location, built a church there, and there was a Byzantine, an Orthodox church there for hundreds of years. At some point, perhaps during the Crusader period or sometime afterwards, it became a Catholic church. So today, if you wish to go to the site of the house of Caiaphas, you can go there. There's a Catholic church on that site, and it's called St. Peter of the Cock Crow. And outside of the church is the very courtyard where St. Peter was warming himself and denied the Lord 3 times. And that's why the church has that name, St. Peter of the Cock Crow. But you could go there, and it's very exciting that these places were identified long ago, and the memory of those locations was kept in the life of the church. The church was continually in Jerusalem, and people remembered where these things happened. And of course, thanks to St. Helen, we wouldn't have been able to find these places today, but thanks to St. Helen, who built churches on all these sites, we know where these places these things actually occurred. So the Lord was arrested in the middle of the night in the Garden of Gethsemane and is taken to the house of Caiaphas. Now, one of the questions that was asked to me was, how can all of these things happen in one night? And that's because the location of these different events is not that far away. They're not walking miles and miles and miles. They're walking, half a mile, maybe less than that, a quarter of a mile. They're not going that far. Even to get from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, it's not that far. You can walk there relatively quickly. So does not suggest that these things happened over a longer period of time, like 2 nights, for example, instead of all in one night. Let's begin with 3 questions. What kind of proceeding is this? Who is present? And again, where is this taking place versus where should it have taken place? St. John mentions a kind of preliminary trial or questioning by Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. That is not described here. John does not have the Jewish trial of Jesus. John's gospel specifically includes events and details that are not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. So John does not have the Jewish trial at all, but he does have that questioning by Caiaphas. Matthew, on the other hand, who is our evangelist for our study here, does not have the interrogation by Annas, but goes straight into the Jewish trial. And of course, it happens at the house of Caiaphas, which is a very odd place for a trial to take place, and it's happening in the middle of the night, which means that this is kind of an emergency meeting, although it seems that because they knew they would be arresting Jesus, they had already arranged for the Jewish leaders to be present at the house of Caiaphas to interrogate Jesus. And we know that because it tells us that they had already gathered. If you read carefully, it says that they had already gathered. Now, it's never a good sign when someone is put on trial in the middle of the night secretly. And that is, of course, exactly what's happening to Jesus. And as he gets arrested and the disciples scatter, it's only Peter and John who are following to actually find out where he is. The rest of them scatter, and presumably they do not know where he has been taken. So here he is, and we know that this is going to result in his conviction. Anybody would know that. This is the kind of proceeding. This is why civilized nations have trials that are public and take place in the daytime in a public place rather than at night in secret at somebody's house, because that is a sign that justice is not going to take place. And that's exactly what happens to the Lord. Now, trials of the Great Sanhedrin, or any meetings of the Great Sanhedrin, were supposed to take place in a specific location on the Temple Mount, a room where the Sanhedrin met, called the Chamber of Hewn Stones, Hewn, hewn stones. And we don't know why it's called that, why the room was called that. Maybe it was comprised of massive stones. Maybe that's why. But that was where the Sanhedrin was supposed to meet, and they were obligated to meet during the day. So this is an irregular proceeding. The question is it really a trial? Is it a trial, or is it some preliminary investigation to gather information from Jesus by which they could formally convict him at an official trial in the next morning? I think that is the case, because we see that the following morning there is another gathering of the Sanhedrin, maybe the more formal or official proceeding, if you will. And we see that in Matthew's gospel and also in Mark's gospel. Here's what, after describing the entire trial in chapter 26, listen to what Matthew has in chapter 27, the very first verse of chapter 27, after having described this whole trial. When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. Well, they had already decided to put him to death the night before. They had already met the night before. But it says when morning came, they took counsel. In other words, they met as a group and agreed to put Jesus to death. They had already agreed, as I said, the night before. So what's this about? This shows us that this is that mention of the morning meeting of the council is the official condemnation of Jesus. So why doesn't Mark describe it? Why doesn't Matthew describe it? Because the important thing that happened was what happened the night before, when Jesus said these things, when Caiaphas questioned him, when the witnesses were brought. So the morning meeting is kind of an official rubber stamp of the decision to put him to death the night before. But in both cases, by the way, Luke only mentions a morning meeting. And that's because I think he says, well, we'll just set it in the morning, which is, rather than saying this happened at night and then there was something else in the morning, he puts them together in the morning. But in either case, whether they met at night, which was irregular and illegal at Caiaphas's house, or in the morning, in either case, this was an illegal trial, because for at least two reasons: that witnesses, or we said the accused, we could say, was not allowed to be put on trial the day before a feast. And the following day was Passover, a feast. And for a second reason, if you were to put someone on trial and convict and find them innocent, or not guilty at least, they could be released immediately. But if you were to put someone on trial and they decided to convict him to death, then they had to wait until the following morning, at least one night passed, before they could sentence anyone to death. So in other words, you were supposed to, it was a very wise rule that was part of Jewish law, that you could not convict someone to death after immediately having the trial. First you have the trial, they decide, we should sentence him to death, but then they couldn't officially pronounce that statement until at least they had slept on it. In other words, to prevent a miscarriage of justice or a rush to judgment, they had to wait. Now, you might say, well, isn't that exactly what they did? They tried Jesus in the middle of the night, and in the morning, they had a council meeting again to put him to death. Well, the problem with that is that for Jews, the night starts at sunset. So the night meeting was effectively the same day as the morning meeting, if you understand what I'm saying. And in either case, it was still the day before Passover, which was going to happen at sunset on Friday. So either way, it's clearly an illegal trial. So, but now somebody says, well, how do you know it's illegal? Because, why would they do that? Well, you know what? All kinds of illegal things happen every day, even in our world. And so people will get accomplished whatever it is that they want to accomplish if they're determined, and they don't care if it's legal or not. They're going to break the law if it's necessary. And in this case, they didn't care. Now, other people will say, I'll just mention this, the reason some people would question what I just said is because these rules were not written down until later. And some people dispute whether or not these were the actual rules that were in place during the first century. They are codified in the Mishnah, which isn't written down until about 200, around the year 200 AD. So that was obviously after this time. But we see in the trial itself the emphasis on following the same kinds of rules that we see in the Mishnah. So some people say, well, it wasn't written down till later, so those rules weren't in effect during the first century, but I think they were. So scholars dispute as to whether or not those rules that were later written down in the Mishnah and sort of officially enshrined in the Mishnah and then later in the Talmud were in effect at the time. I think they were, and I'm going to point that out to you, especially where we see the insistence or the determination to have two witnesses. That's part of Jewish law. Okay, so we have this meeting, this second meeting in the morning, but we're going to go ahead and talk about the evening meeting tonight. So it's taking place at the home of Caiaphas. Who is present? That's the second question, preliminary question we're going to discuss. Who is present? Now, in verse 57, it says, those who had seized Jesus, and those are the temple guards, remember, not Romans. Romans were not involved in the arrest of Jesus. They had absolutely no reason to be involved in this. Roman involvement would come after he had been found deserving of death and sentenced to death. Then they go to the Romans with Jesus, and it is clear in all the Gospels that Pilate has never heard of Jesus before, has no idea why Jesus is being brought to him. The Romans are not involved in the arrest of Jesus Christ. Those who seized Jesus, the temple guards, led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered. So you see, they were already there. The scribes and the elders are already at the house of the high priest Caiaphas. So it's Caiaphas, scribes, and elders. And then in verse 59, it says, now the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus. So you have Caiaphas, scribes, elders, and chief priests, and the whole council. So presumably that included other people, probably some Sadducees and some Pharisees. So this is a meeting of the great Sanhedrin. The word that is used here is Synedrion, Sanhedrin, which simply was a kind of council. But there's no way that this is just any council or any gathering. So the Bible does not use the term the Great Sanhedrin, but without a doubt, this is because it's happening in front of Caiaphas and at Caiaphas's house, this is a gathering of the Great Sanhedrin, the most important ruling body of the Jews, the highest court, if you will, of the land when they were functioning as a court. But mostly they were a deliberative body. They were a legislative body that was presided over by the high priest, in this case, Caiaphas. There were also lesser Sanhedrins in other locations in Palestine. They were groups of 23 men. This is 72 men of the leading citizens of Jerusalem, the most influential and the wealthiest men of the city. Chief priests, Sadducees, Pharisees, elders who were the leading and respected citizens, certainly presided over by the high priest. These are the most eminent, the most important and influential men in all of the land. And the reason why Jesus, we can be confident that he was brought before them is because the great Sanhedrin didn't hear just every case, any case. There were smaller courts in villages and towns. A court is called a gathering of a court, a bet din, is they would hear ordinary cases. But somebody extraordinary like Jesus, they would have been brought before the great Sanhedrin because they had exclusive jurisdiction over certain types of cases. And the most important were three. They alone, only the great Sanhedrin could put on trial, the king, the high priest, if he were accused of something, or a false prophet. And it is without a doubt that Jesus is being brought before them, having been accused of being a false prophet. And there are hints of this in the Gospel of John. I think John more effectively brings out this nuance that Jesus was regarded by them as a false prophet. I think you could figure that out for yourself, that he's regarded as a false prophet because they've already accused him earlier in this gospel of casting out demons by the power of the devil and breaking the law of Moses and all kinds of other things. But it is really John who brings this out very effectively in chapter 7 and 8 in his gospel, where he clearly says that the people were whispering about Jesus. He's leading the people astray. Those are key words from the Jewish scriptures that are used to describe a false prophet. So although that language isn't seen in the synoptic gospels, John has that language in his gospel, and we know that this is the charge, and this is what they have in mind when they bring Jesus before the great Sanhedrin. So the great Sanhedrin alone could put on trial the king, the high priest, or a false prophet. And isn't it ironic that Jesus is brought before them as a false prophet, but in fact, he is the King of Israel and the great high priest of heaven. So who is present at the gathering? We said the chief priests, Caiaphas, the scribes and elders, the whole council. Let's take a moment and talk about the chief priests. Who are they? I think I had told you way back when we talked about the cleansing of the temple, way back. Well, it was a few weeks ago, some weeks ago. The cleansing of the temple, I told you we would discuss the high priest or the chief priest because we were talking about the ordinary priests. There were about 15,000 or 20,000 ordinary priests who served in the temple. These are ordinary priests, people like the father of John the Baptist, Zacharias, who spent only 2 weeks at the temple on rotation. They had 2 rotations per year. They would go to the temple for 1 week and serve there, and then go home and return on another rotation for 1 week. And they were present at the 3 pilgrim festivals, the 3 festivals which all Jewish men were required to come to. And one of those is Passover. So they would go to the temple at least 5 times a year and serve in the temple. Those are ordinary priests who had some other job that by which they supported themselves. Fishing, agriculture, mostly farmers. Maybe they were working with their hands as tradesmen. They had some other job, some other profession, and then they came to the temple. But they were at the temple usually for a week at a time. And because this was time out away from their ordinary work, they were given some compensation in the form of animal skins, because very often the entire animal was not burnt as a sacrifice. The animal was skinned, and those were very valuable. Animal skins, hides were very valuable. You make leather things out of them and the like. Also, they might be given meat or produce offerings or other offerings which the faithful worshipers would come to the temple carrying as an offering. So that was part of their compensation. That's the ordinary priests. The chief priests did not work at any other job. They were the elite, the wealthy, privileged class of priests, very different from the ordinary priests. And these were the people, along with the rest of the great Sanhedrin, that the Romans held responsible to rule Judea. So you might think, well, the Romans are ruling. They kind of were. Of course, they were ultimately responsible for that province, the province of Judea, which included Samaria. But the Romans did not directly rule these places on a day-to-day basis without the assistance of wealthy, local, influential people. And this wasn't just in Palestine. This was throughout the Roman world. The way that the Romans were able to manage this vast territory is that they were assisted in this matter by wealthy and powerful local rulers, local families in different parts of the Roman world. And so, in other words, if you were part of the aristocracy, you wanted to keep your power and your influence and your authority in your land, your kingdom, if you were a local king of some type, or you're a wealthy aristocrat, the way you got to do that once Rome had conquered your area was by cooperating with the Romans. Then you got to keep all your money and all your power and all your influence as long as you cooperated with the Romans. And that's what people did. That's exactly what was happening here in Judea. So the chief priests were working hand in hand with the Romans and to maintain order over the ordinary people. And that's why the chief priests typically supported very harsh treatments for political terrorists, kind of religious fanatics, general rabble-rousers, or anybody else who might threaten the order. Because if you could not keep order, Rome would take away your authority and give it to somebody else who would keep order. So these were the people who were managing all of the affairs of the Jewish people and the temple, and they got a lot out of it. They're not motivated purely for the love of God and the desire to keep the sacrificial system going. They're getting a lot out of it. They have power and they get money out of it. They are extremely wealthy, especially compared to the ordinary Jewish person at the time. So, Jewish priests, the priests were very respected, but they also the ordinary Jewish priests were respected, but the chief priests held immense power and wealth. Today, of course, there are no Jewish priests because there is no temple. A priest is not a rabbi. A rabbi is a teacher of the law. A priest sacrificed animals. They didn't do anything else. They offered other kinds of sacrifices, but they didn't marry people or have catechism or anything like that. Don't think there's anything else involved. Chief priests and ordinary priests worked at the temple, and they have everything to do with the temple sacrificial system. So there are a lot of people today who are descended from Jewish priests, and you might know somebody who has the name Cohen. That word, Cohen, means priest. So someone back in their family, originally going way, way, way back, had been a priest. So the chief priests are different from the ordinary priests who do the actual work, examining the wood for the sacrifice. We could say, examining the animals to make sure that they were fit for sacrifice, receiving the animals, bringing the shewbread forward, sacrificing the lambs, every day, twice a day, and all these other little activities, and just maintaining everything inside the court of the priests had to be maintained by people who were priests because no one else could set foot in that sacred space. So this was what the ordinary priests were doing. But the chief priests were responsible for the management of all of those ordinary priests and their activities, and they made their living from the temple. They were the ones who coordinated all these activities. They literally held the keys to the temple courts. They were overseeing all the money that was flowing into the temple. They're the ones who paid Judas because they have access to all that coinage, which was immense. There was so much coinage in the temple treasury. Nobody was even sure how much money was in there. Even Roman historians talked about the immense wealth at the temple. Just by way of reminder, I described the temple very specifically with a lot of detail some weeks ago. You can go back and find the lesson if you want to about the temple at Jerusalem prior to the discussion of the lesson of Jesus cleansing the temple, which is an action which led really to his condemnation here at the trial. So if you want to find that, you can find it at Ancient Faith and Search the Scriptures Live, or you can go to orthodoxbiblestudy.info, and you're going to find all the lessons there on one page. I know that sometimes it's hard to find these lessons on ancient faith. But they're there, but they can be more difficult to find. So we have the chief priests responsible for all of this money, but also they're responsible for the security of the temple, all of the purchases that were made. And we're talking about a massive, massive complex, which used a lot of wood, oil, wine, salt, procured animals. They had to buy all of this from vendors, which means that they got kickbacks. Okay, we're talking about incense, flour, wood, salt, cleaning of the temples, the casting of temple curtains, the casting of lots. All of these things were managed, not physically done by the chief priests, but managed by the chief priests. So they're the ones who really are in charge of the temple. Obviously, the high priest can't do everything by himself. So what we're talking about here is these are the people, the chief priests, who are involved in the arrest of Jesus. They're the ones who are responsible for the arrest of Jesus, not the Pharisees. We're thinking Pharisees and scribes because they're the ones who seem to clash with Jesus a lot, especially in Galilee. But now Jesus is in Jerusalem. It is to the chief priests that Judas went. It is the chief priests who order his arrest. It is the chief priests who are in charge of the temple guards, who send the temple guards to the garden to arrest Jesus. And now here they are back at Caiaphas's house, and they're going to put him on trial. So it is these men who use their positions to enrich themselves, to ensconce themselves with power and authority that are responsible for the arrest and the crucifixion of Jesus. So what I'm telling you here about their tremendous corruption, which is just legendary, we do not know about from Christian sources, but we know about these things from Jewish sources. It is Jewish sources of the first century and the later centuries that talk about the immense corruption of the high priesthood and the chief priests, about the nepotism, about the mistreatment of ordinary priests by these aristocratic priests. They would literally, I told you that the ordinary priests would be paid with the hides and the meat and the offerings and vegetable offerings and fruit offerings of the worshipers. But the chief priests were so greedy that when these items were being distributed to the ordinary priests at the end of their rotation, so they could take their payment and go home, the chief priests would send their servants to where these distributions were being made and literally beat the ordinary priests with sticks and clubs and steal their payment, steal their wages. And this is known to us from Jewish sources that describe this and describe the immense corruption of the high priests and the chief priests. And Jewish sources are the ones that tell us that this is why God allowed the temple to be destroyed. So I'm not saying this because it's anti-Semitic. I'm telling you what Jewish sources said. And again, there's a lot more detail in my book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. We're overdue for a break, so let's take a break at this time. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the rest of the players at this trial and get into the trial itself. So join me after the break.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are central events in our salvation. Yet few Christians have a good grasp of the first-century historical and religious context in which the crucifixion took place, nor of its true significance for the people of that time, and hence for our time as well. In her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, Biblical scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantinou puts modern readers in the center of the events of Christ's Passion, bringing the best of modern scholarship to bear while keeping her interpretation faithful in every particular to the early church tradition. If you love Search the Scriptures live on Ancient Faith Radio, you'll also love The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, available now at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so when the Lord cleansed the temple, he directly challenged the greed, the excess, the abuse of power by these temple authorities, the chief priests and the high priest. They were using the temple as for their personal profit. So the Lord was opposed to their greed and their corruption. Remember what he said, "You have made my Father's house into a den of robbers," literally. Because this is what they were literally doing. They were robbing ordinary priests of their wages after they served at the temple. Imagine being so wealthy and still stealing from ordinary, humble priests who simply left their ordinary occupations to come to Jerusalem for a week and needed some kind of compensation for that. So Jesus was not some little, rabbi from some village. Jesus by now had a huge following. He was very influential. He was very powerful. He was well known. He was regarded as a prophet because he was very well known for his healings, for his powers. And, they were concerned. The high priests were very concerned that Jesus could disrupt everything by leading people into a revolt against them. And that would mean that the authorities would come, the Roman authorities would take away their power and give the ruling of Judea over to somebody else who would maintain order. So another group that was mentioned here are the elders. It says where the elders and the whole council had gathered. The elders had gathered, where the scribes and the elders had gathered after they arrested Jesus. Now, so this group is a little bit more difficult to define. Nobody's exactly sure who is meant by the elders, but they seem to be a class of aristocracy that's separate from the priesthood. Priests were very influential, but these people are all laymen, and they may very well have come from long-standing, very aristocratic families that were sort of advisors to previous kings and priests, and they formed part of this council. And one of the people whom we are going to meet is Joseph of Arimathea. He is said to be a member of the council, but he's not a priest, and he's not a Pharisee, and he's not a scribe. He's just a wealthy man who was part of an old family that was very well established in Jerusalem, that is highly respected. So this kind of aristocracy, whether it's lay or priestly, was something that really supported this imperial system that gave Rome the ability to manage these vast areas of territory. And it was how injustice and corruption was allowed to continue. So, ordinary Jews were very aware of this. It's not like they were stupid. They could see how wealthy the chief priests and the high priests were. Meanwhile, they're practically starving to death and they're being crushed by Roman taxes. And nonetheless, nobody really cared about them. They could see how wealthy and corrupt their religious officials were. And this is, of course, something that Jesus is rejecting and responding to. And eventually this kind of frustration, when people see this and they know what's happening, it explodes. And when the Jews finally did revolt against Rome in the year 66, they killed some of these aristocrats. They murdered one of the high priests, and they burned some of the temple archives, etc. So I already told you where the Great Sanhedrin was supposed to meet, but here we are. And at Caiaphas's house, they're supposed to meet on the Temple Mount, but here they are at Caiaphas's house. So let's read the trial, we could say transcript itself, as it is given to us by St. Matthew. Matthew 26, verse 59. Now, the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you, by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat on his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" All right, so it's a very interesting statement here in verse 59 when it says, the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. So why would they be looking for false testimony? Well, it's not necessarily the case that they're looking for false testimony, but true testimony would not convict Jesus because he hadn't done anything that was deserving of death. So that's why Matthew highlights that, the fact that really they're looking for any kind of testimony. You see the corruption in the proceedings. They'll take any testimony, even false testimony, because they're determined to find him guilty of something so that they can put him to death. But it suggests that this was taking a while, because here it says they sought false testimony. It really should be translated as they were seeking false testimony, because this is in the imperfect tense, azitun, instead of the completed past tense, which was the aorist. It's the imperfect. It's suggesting it was ongoing. They were looking for. It took a longer time. They hadn't already looked for. They were looking for. So this is imperfect tense. And they're searching for people who will come forward and offer false testimony. They don't care if it's false, as long as it will stick. It says, but they found none, and then 2 came forward. Now, what is the meaning of this? How can they say that they found none? No, even false testimony, but then 2 came forward. Well, there had been a number of witnesses. It says, although many witnesses came, they found none, although then 2 came forward. Many witnesses came, even offering false testimony, but it wasn't sufficient because they didn't agree. This is another element of Jewish law. Not only did they have to have 2 witnesses, they had to agree on every detail. And again, this was a way to prevent a miscarriage of justice. So it was a good rule. Now, what happened here? So that the previous witnesses, there was a parade of witnesses and they did not agree. What's happening here? Somehow they find 2 to agree. You can figure out what happened. You can sort of figure out they must have taken 2 people aside before they entered and said, listen, guys, get your story straight. You say the same thing, because if they testified to different things, if the details were different, that testimony could not stand. Finally, it tells us how they got 2 people to come forward and exactly what they said. And here it is. Here is what they said. And by the way, all these witnesses are men. Women were not allowed to testify in Jewish courts, except in one very narrow exception, and that's not this. This is what they said. This fellow said, or this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So that's the false testimony, because Jesus did not say that. Jesus never said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. he said something kind of similar. And this is rather interesting because Matthew's gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have nothing like this statement, nothing even close to it. Jesus says, you've made my Father's house a den of thieves when he cleanses the temple. But John's gospel has something kind of similar in John's account of the cleansing of the temple. After the Jewish authorities confront Jesus in John's gospel, Jesus says to them, to the authorities, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up again. So that is a historical statement of Jesus, but not what the witnesses says. I will destroy or am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. So, of course, when Jesus makes the statement, as it is recorded in John's gospel, destroy this temple, he's talking to the Jewish leaders. They're the ones who want to destroy his temple. And the temple, of course, is his body. This is what he's talking about. Destroy this temple, my body, and I will raise it up in 3 days. So in that case, it is Jesus's body that is being destroyed, and the destroyers are the chief priests. Okay, but in this case, what the witnesses are saying is that the one who's doing the destroying is Jesus. And the thing that he's planning to destroy or saying that he can destroy is the physical temple itself, the building of the temple itself, the structure itself. Okay, so they have it wrong. It's totally wrong. But the council doesn't care. They don't care at all because now they have two witnesses who are testifying to the same exact statement by Jesus. Can you see why it took so long to get two witnesses to agree? Because what Jesus said was not what they said. And it wasn't at all something that he said, nothing that was deserving. We don't know what the other one said, but certainly nothing that was deserving of the death penalty. And even this is not really deserving of the death penalty. Just think about it. What if he said it? I can destroy this temple and in 3 days raise it up. How is that possible? This was a massive structure, which I described to you at length. There's no way he could even destroy it, they would realize, or even build it up in 3 days. So why would they be so concerned about what would apparently be an impossible claim? Well, and by the way, so not only why would they be concerned, but what is it about the temple that led to their concerns? And what is it about the temple that is associated with the Messiah? Because this statement is what triggers the questioning by the high priest. Now that there are two witnesses that agree on the same thing, now the trial commences. Before this, there's no trial. You don't realize it because you think, oh, there's a trial and things are going on. And by the way, now that since we're discussing the trial, there was the people who are present are members of the Great Sanhedrin. Nobody else is there. So it's amazing to me how so many movies about Jesus have been made over the years don't keep the same basic facts. I mean, in that movie, the Passion of the Christ that was put out by Mel Gibson some years ago, I don't know now, maybe like, when was that, 2003 or 2004, something like that. In that scene that they have supposedly of Jesus' trial, they don't even ask him about this. They don't have the witnesses saying that. Instead, it's like a mob scene, and Mary Magdalene is there, and Peter's there, and John is there, and all these people are present as Jesus is being surrounded by these hostile, Jewish leaders asking him stupid questions like, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus wasn't asked, are you the king of the Jews? And nobody was there except there was a proceeding. There was an orderly proceeding. The people who were there were members of the Great Sanhedrin. So it's kind of silly the way that was presented. I couldn't understand it for the life of me. There is a concern as soon as there's a reference to what they think is a prophecy of or an expectation that this person will destroy the temple. There's an immediate alarm in the minds of the high priests and the chief priests because of the importance of the temple religiously and for them financially. So in Jeremiah chapter 26, The priests and false prophets literally condemned Jeremiah, the prophet himself, to death for prophesizing the destruction of the temple. He was condemned to death for that. And that wasn't carried out, but that was considered a very serious charge, to prophesy that the temple would be destroyed. Here, they're not saying that Jesus made a prophecy that the temple would be destroyed. They're saying that he himself was threatening to destroy the temple, which we know would be physically impossible to do because it was massive. So the temple was extremely important, had great significance. We've spoken about this already. It was the place where God dwelt with his people. There was a real belief, a real feeling, a real sense. And I think there was a reality that the presence of God was there in the temple with the people. And the scriptures often speak about the glory of the God filling the temple, the kavod of God. And the presence of God was there in a very palpable way, in a very real way. And so this is something that the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, they're talking about Solomon's temple, prophesied that would depart. God would depart from the temple. That's what Ezekiel said. The glory of God left the temple. The presence of God is leaving the temple, and that meant the temple would be destroyed. Solomon's temple was destroyed. At the time of Christ, we're talking here about the second temple that was built after the Jews returned from exile. But it was so important. And the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Romans, after the Jews revolted against Rome, was a very tragic day, and it changed Judaism forever. It was the end of the sacrificial system. It was the end of many of the requirements and the rituals that were required by the Jewish law. But it was a huge complex. It occupied 25% of the total land space in the city of Jerusalem. It was the religious center of the nation. It was the worship center of the nation. A lot of people relied on it for their livelihood. The Jews would come there from all over the world to worship at the temple. So to prophesy the destruction of the temple would be considered very serious, but it also meant that you're saying that God would abandon his people by allowing the temple to be destroyed. So they're very concerned about this, but they're also concerned because of the prophecies that a Messiah would build a new temple. So we're going to get to that in a minute. So it is because the two witnesses have said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple and in 3 days build it up again. Now the trial begins. Prior to that, the high priest is not questioning Jesus. So when I say a trial begins, you had to have a charge, just like today. You can't just be put on trial without being faced with some kind of a charge. First, you would be arrested and charged with violating some law, and then you get put on trial. They just don't put you on trial without having any kind of a charge. That's the charge. The charge is that Jesus said, I am able to destroy the temple and in 3 days raise it up. Prior to that, they've got nothing. And until they get two people to agree that Jesus said the same exact thing, both of them repeat the same exact words, then there is no trial. Now, this is I'm not talking about the appearance before Annas, because that's only in the Gospel of John. But this is one of the reasons why Jesus says, in John's Gospel, Jesus is taken to Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, and when Annas tries to ask Jesus questions, Jesus says, where are the witnesses? Basically, that's what he says, because he knows that that's the procedure. First, you have to call witnesses. You're not allowed to question somebody without leveling a charge. And first, you call the witnesses, and then that's the charge. With the witness statements are basically the charge. They form the basis of what the person of the crime the person is charged with having committed. So you begin with the witnesses. We don't operate that way today, modernly. So after the witnesses say the same thing that Jesus said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and in 3 days build it up, which he did not say. You have to remember, he did not say that. He said, if you destroy this temple, meaning himself, I will raise it up. Okay. After the witnesses make the false statement, it says Matthew says in verse 62, and the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? So we're going to talk about the high priest, which here, of course, we know it is Caiaphas. The high priest was, without a doubt, the most powerful man in the entire Jewish world. And the position had become very politicized. And by the way, we talk about the high priest, and he's running the Sanhedrin. He's in charge of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the ruling body of the Jews throughout the Roman world, not just in Judea. They had power and authority throughout the Roman world. They're the ones who deputize Saul of Tarsus and give him authority to go to Damascus to arrest followers of Jesus, who are, of course, they're Jewish followers of Jesus, way up in Damascus, which is not in Palestine. So I had somebody, challenge me on this, that this is not historical, that how could Saul have, jurisdiction to arrest people? Don't think about it the way it is today, that he's going to some other country. First of all, the Romans recognized Jewish authority. They recognized the authority of the Jews to manage their own affairs, regardless of where they were in the world. That's a fact. And you could see that, especially in the book of Acts, that the Romans do not get involved in religious affairs, and they expected the Jews to discipline themselves and their own people. So when they issue orders that the followers of Jesus are to be arrested, and that they heard that some of them had gone up to Damascus or anywhere else, of course no Roman official is going to stop them. It's not like you could go appeal to the Romans and say, these guys are trying to arrest me and take me back to Jerusalem, and they don't have jurisdiction. The Romans would not get involved in that. The Romans would say, go ahead, arrest them, because we see the Romans allowing literally the beating of Jews right in front of the Roman magistrate in the book of Acts. Okay, they're beating the Christians right in front of the Jews are beating the Christians, like Jason, who was the head of, who was in whose house a church was meeting, because the Romans did not get involved in these things. So you can't take your ideas, your notions about how justice operated, how it operates today in the 21st century, and apply it back to Roman Empire. It didn't work like that. So the high priest is in charge of everything, and under him the Sanhedrin, or along with him the Sanhedrin. And so this was a very political position, and he was the one who cooperated most closely with the Romans to keep his power and his position and that of the chief priests and these ruling aristocratic priestly families. Now, these high priestly families were extremely wealthy. They had very expensive clothing and perfume and jewelry, and the women were extremely pampered. The daughters got huge dowries, and the wives had huge retirement, from their husband. They were ship owners, they were traders, they owned land from which they received a lot of fruits and a lot of returns. Almost everyone who worked in the temple as one of the chief priests had his position because he's a friend or usually a relative of the high priest, because these were very lucrative positions for which people got bribes and kickbacks and things like this. Now, the high priest also had expenditures to make. He often had to buy the sacrificial animals that were required for him to sacrifice for himself prior to doing the sacrifices for the nation. He had to do a lot of things. He had to maintain a very high degree of ritual purity and a lot of other things. Now, the high priest was supposed to serve for life. That's what it says in the Torah. But this had ceased to be the practice a long time before the time of Christ. The high priesthood had already become corrupted long before the Romans appeared on the scene. And also, the high priests were supposed to be anointed by the pouring of sacred oil on their heads. This also had stopped being the practice hundreds of years before, and we don't really know why or how that happened. But we do know that at least from the 2nd century BC, the Hasmonean family, by the way, Those are the Maccabees, the Maccabee brothers who led the revolt against the Greek Seleucid rulers. They are the leaders. That family, their family name is Hasmonean, not Maccabee. Maccabee is a nickname for them. So the Hasmonean family was a priestly family, but not from the lineage of the high priest. And when they succeeded in achieving independence for the Jewish people, then they took over not only as kings, but as also high priests. And also, even before they revolted, the high priesthood had been corrupted. High priests were receiving their positions by bribing the Seleucid Greek rulers in Antioch in Syria. So already the priesthood was very corrupt, long before the time of Christ. So then when Herod the Great became the king of Judea, he took it under his control to appoint the high priests. And then after him, the Romans, when they took over, they began to appoint and depose the high priest. Well, how did they choose the high priest? What do you think? Do you think that the Romans or Herod the Great or anybody else said, I'm going to choose the most pious man, I'm going to choose the most humble man? Of course not. They wanted the person who would give them the biggest bribe and cooperate with them to keep the people under control. And that's what they did. So not only, although the high priest was supposed to serve for life, like any one of our patriarchs or the Pope or something like that, instead, the Romans would appoint a high priest every year because that way they got a bribe every year. So this was a very lucrative source of income for the Roman governors. And this is why men like Pontius Pilate would stay in some God-forsaken place like Judea. That's what they would have thought of it as, way, way far away from Rome and all the wonderful things about life in Rome. That's why they stayed in a place like Judea, so that they could get kickbacks, so that they could get bribes from appointing not only the high priest, but other like tax collectors and all kinds of other lower officials. And so the high priest had to be wealthy so that they could pay these bribes. And Caiaphas certainly fit the bill. And it is Caiaphas that 4 leading families controlled the high priesthood for about 200 years. 4 aristocratic families, none of whom was actually descended from the right family according to how it was supposed to work. But in the time of the 1st century, it is primarily the family of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who rules the high priesthood, because Annas himself had been high priest earlier in the 1st century, and then he had 5 sons. 4 of them were high priests before the time of this trial. Now it is Caiaphas, Annas's son-in-law, who is the high priest. And after Caiaphas, there will be one more son of Annas, who is the high priest. So that's most of the time, because the temple was destroyed in the year 70. So for most of that period during the 1st century, during the life of Christ, it is the family of Annas that's controlling the high priesthood and the temple and all the money. So we're looking at a massively corrupt system. We've gone over time again. Let's take a break at this point, and we will continue by continuing and analyzing Caiaphas, the question that he asks of Jesus, and how Jesus comes to answer in the way that brings about a proclamation of the death penalty. Join me after the break.
This March, join us for the 31 Books of March sale event at Ancient Faith Store. In celebration of the event's 10th anniversary, we're offering a large selection of books at 50% off every day from March 1st through March 31st. Over 150 titles reset each morning at 9 a.m. Central. Explore books on Orthodox faith, theology, history, and more. all at a discounted price. You'll also find children's books and titles by popular podcasters and hosts from Ancient Faith Radio. Each day brings a fresh collection of books at an incredible savings. Visit us at store.ancientfaith.com. There's not a day you'll want to miss during the 31 books of March.
Okay, so Caiaphas was a giant in his day, and he was high priest for 18 years. Now, Pilate was only in Judea for 12 years. That's a long time, by the way. We'll talk about Pilate next week. But having Caiaphas as a high priest for 18 years, a very, very long time, I think he was the longest tenure of any high priest during the first century, shows his wealth, his political power, his shrewdness, his ambition, and that this is a tremendously powerful person who is now questioning Christ. And it shows, of course, also that he cooperated very well with the Romans. Caiaphas wouldn't be there that long if he wasn't able to handle the Romans and all of the different personalities in Judea at the time. So once the two witnesses say that Jesus said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and in 3 days build it up again. Now the trial begins, and Caiaphas asks Jesus a question. Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? What do you have to say for yourself, in other words? And because this is not a capital offense, claiming to be able to destroy the temple, it's just not going to get the death penalty. So he really wants more from Jesus. He wants Jesus to say something so incriminating that it will call for the death penalty. But of course, Jesus is silent. So Jesus does not want to respond. He's been silent this entire time. He could have said, that's not what I said. And that would be the truth, because he did not say that. He did not say, I can destroy the temple of God. He said, if you destroy this temple, my body, then I will raise it up again. But he could have said that. He could have refuted what the witnesses said, but he is silent. And why is he silent? Of course, this is fulfillment of prophecy, as we know. But really, he knows that they're going to convict him. He's not going to participate in this. And of course, he had decided to be obedient to the will of the Father after praying in the garden. He just decides he's going to accept whatever they decide to do. That's the will of God, and so he's just silent. And there's a certain dignity that he maintains by this. And St. John Chrysostom said that he didn't see any point in defending himself to people who were not interested in hearing the truth. And actually, in St. Luke's Gospel, we have something like that in the words of the Lord, where he says, even if when they ask him, are you the Messiah? In St. Luke's Gospel, he says, if I tell you yes, you won't believe me. So St. John Chrysostom is exactly right. Why should he defend himself to people who are going to find him guilty anyhow? They're not interested in the truth. And we see that elsewhere in the Gospel as well. The Lord did not engage in dialogue with people who were not interested in hearing the truth of what he has to say. So Jesus was silent, and that is why he maintained his silence. So then, why does he choose to break his silence and speak? It is because he refuses to speak, and they really want him to incriminate himself by saying something that will call for the death penalty, that Caiaphas places him under oath. And this is an interesting feature of Jewish law. Caiaphas says, I adjure you, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, what about this? What's going on here with this I adjure you stuff? Well, it's not that Caiaphas is placing Jesus under oath here. There was a question, and if you want somebody to be forced to answer it, you state this formula, And in Greek, it is exorkizo. It's a very strong word. It's a technical word. It's found only here in the New Testament, actually in Matthew's gospel. So it shows us his understanding of the exact language that would be used. It's found in the Old Testament and is found in the Mishnah, in this formula, exorkizo, I adjure you, I command you, I place you under oath, because the word for oath is orkos, but exorkizo makes it stronger. I compel you to respond. You are required to respond. So this is very, very different than what we have, especially in America, where a defendant is not obligated to respond to a question, especially one that might be incriminating him. So he's not obligated to respond. But here they have exactly the opposite. They can compel you to respond, even if it means you're going to incriminate yourself. So the Jews believed that when a person was placed under oath, having called upon the name of God, their response, a truthful response, was guaranteed because they had called upon the name of God. So that having been said, why is it that Jesus chooses to respond to the question instead of just remaining silent as he had thus far? Well, that's because if you remained silent, even after you are told, exorkizo, I adjure you, in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the question here. If he remains silent, it will be considered to be an admission of guilt. So he might as well speak. In other words, when they ask you a question and you don't answer, it's as though you're admitting the truth of this statement. But what is really remarkable here is that the statement of the high priest is exactly the same statement for which Peter was praised way back in chapter 16, when the disciples were asked by Jesus, who do men say that I am? And some of them say, oh, you're John the Baptist come alive again, or you're one of the prophets like Jeremiah. And he says, who do you say that I am? Everybody's silent until Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And he is praised for that. And this is the statement of faith in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, those exact words have come out of the mouth of the high priest. And that means that the high priest is privy to the truth about Jesus Christ, even if it's very ironic that it is the same exact language. And now Christ is going to bear to the truth about himself. And it's ironic because he's saying the truth, even the high priest is saying the truth, even if he doesn't know it. Just like in John's gospel, when it says that the high priest says, he's going to die for the sake of the nation. And he's sort of making a prophecy, even though he doesn't realize, the high priest doesn't realize he's making a prophecy. He has spoken the truth about Jesus Christ in the question itself. And St. John Chrysostom actually mentions this too. He says that they already knew who Jesus believed himself to be. They've had so many interactions with the Lord. They were constantly challenging him. They were constantly attempting to trap him. They knew who he thought he was, and he responds to them now. Chrysostom concludes to take away all excuse, because to the very end, he taught that he was the Christ. And he's exactly right about this. The Lord decides to speak, because if he says nothing, he will be found guilty of claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God, anyhow. So he says it, he acknowledges it, but he acknowledges it in that very specific way that Jesus had of speaking, and pointing to the fact that the person who said it has said the truth from their own mouth. So what does he say? He says, you said so. But first, before we talk about the meaning of that, let's go back and take a look at the question of the high priest. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God? Tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Well, Jesus had avoided the term Messiah for most of his ministry because the Jews had different ideas about what the Messiah would be. And we see that even among the disciples, that they are convinced that the Messiah means that Jesus is going to establish an earthly kingdom. That's why James and John come to him as he's approaching Jerusalem and ask that they be seated at his right and his left. So we see this idea of a political Messiah, a political Savior who will establish a kingdom. And of course, as they are greeting him as he enters Jerusalem and they're shouting, Hosanna, Son of David, we see these kind of messianic political overtones. So this is something that is kind of what most of the Jews would expect. And that's why Jesus shied away from calling himself the Messiah. And this is why he says, after Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, he says, yes, you are, I am, and he affirms that. And then he says, don't tell anybody this. So now we could also ask the question about Son of God. Are you the Messiah, Son of God? By the way, that title we have also seen here in Matthew's Gospel in the mouth of the devil, who said, if at the temptation, do you remember that? If you are the Son of God, change these stones into bread. Now, most Christians think that Messiah and Son of God are synonymous, but they weren't in the Jewish mind. Somebody could be a son of God, meaning that he's a kind of holy person. Son of God, you are all sons of the Most High. That's in the Psalms. So you could be called Son of God in the way that Adam was the Son of God. So an ordinary believer, we say we're children of God. But Jesus called himself the Son in a very specific manner, in a very exclusive manner. He called himself the Son and God, his Father, in a very different way than when he spoke about God being our Father. He would say, when you guys pray, you say, our Father. But Jesus never put himself in with that group. He was the Son and God, his Father, in a very unique and exclusive manner. But Son of God was not a messianic title. It was something that Jesus identified himself as. And this is why, there are some people who say Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God. We're about to see where he does. But many times he called himself the Son and God his Father. And the early Christians would never have invented that title for him. It is something that the church says of him because he first said it about himself. So, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Now, why does this question come up after the witnesses have said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and in 3 days build it up again? Well, and then it's after that, Caiaphas immediately stands up and says, what do you have to say for yourself? What do you have to say to these witnesses? And Jesus says nothing. And then he directly goes to the question, are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God? Why? What does that have to do with the question about destroying the temple? Here's why. Because there were prophecies that the Messiah would build a new temple. And this was very well known among the Jews, especially during the first century, in the first century BC. This goes back to the prophet Zechariah, who says, behold, the man whose name is Branch, he will grow up in his place and will build the temple of the Lord. That's Zechariah 6:12. Now, who's Branch? Branch was a title for the Messiah. And I think I mentioned that back in December when we went through some of the prophecies, the messianic prophecies in December. Isaiah and Jeremiah also refer to Branch. It's a title for the Messiah. Branch will come forth from the root of Jesse, that's David's father. The stump of Jesse, a branch shall grow out of his roots. That's Isaiah 11:1. And Jeremiah says, the days are coming when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and deal wisely and execute judgment and righteousness in the land. So there was already very strong among the Jewish people the idea that when the Messiah comes, he will build a new temple. And of course, he did. And what was the temple? The temple was his body. And that's exactly what the Lord was talking about. So they, of course, the Sanhedrin, who's watching this trial, does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but they're concerned because they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but they think that Jesus believes he's the Messiah, which, of course, he knows himself to be the Messiah, but they think that Jesus claiming to be the Messiah or hinting that he's the Messiah will lead a revolt against them and their leadership and the Romans, and that will mean the end of their power and authority in Judea. And why are they convinced of this? Because, in other words, Jesus is dangerous for them. They don't know that he doesn't have political ambitions. Even the disciples don't know that because they keep asking Jesus about the kingdom. Even after the resurrection, in Acts chapter 1, what do the disciples do? They're sitting there with the Lord. This is in Acts chapter 1, the very beginning. They said, after the resurrection, they say, Lord, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? They're still thinking in a worldly sense. So, of course, the Sanhedrin assumes that Jesus wants political power, that he wants to set up a kingdom. So why do they think this? Because of the cleansing of the temple, because of the witness statements that he threatened to destroy the temple, even though he never did, because of his entry into Jerusalem on a donkey, which is fulfillment of messianic prophecy, and the crowd shouting at him, welcoming him as son of David, king of Israel, etc., and the fact that most of the people around at the time believed Jesus to be at least a prophet, if not the Messiah, because of his astonishing powers and his charisma, that he attracted these huge crowds of people. So, of course, they're alarmed. And along with this, along with the witness statements about the temple and the concern, their knowledge of the prophecies that the Messiah would build a new temple, then this is why they're very, very concerned. And now they ask him the question, and what does he say? What does the Lord say? You have said so, which we also saw at the Last Supper. You have said so. So he is the reason why Jesus speaks and acknowledges what Caiaphas said is so that when he is rejected by them, as he surely will, he is rejected on the basis of who he really is, on the basis of his identity. It's not because he failed to reveal the truth about himself. It's because they decide that they don't accept the truth of who he is. So just as with Judas, remember when I told you about Judas, why would the Lord choose Judas to be one of the 12? So that he could have no excuse. When he betrayed the Lord, he could not say, I didn't know who he was, because he heard Peter say the confession. He heard Jesus exclaim that that's true, what Peter said. He is the Messiah, the Son of God. He saw everything that the other disciples saw. He wasn't in the dark about anything. And the same thing here with Caiaphas and all these other Jewish leaders. They know or suspect what Jesus thinks about himself. Now he comes out and actually says it. So none of them can say, oh, we didn't know that he was the Messiah, because they're all going to stand before God, who's going to judge them. No one can say we didn't know, because he told them directly who he was. But how does he do it? He says, si ipas, you said so. And this is something that seems to be characteristic of Jesus. He's going to give the same kind of response to Pilate. He said the same thing to Judas when Jesus predicted at the Last Supper, one of you will betray me. All the disciples start saying, it isn't me, Lord, is it? It isn't me, is it? It isn't me, is it? And he says, no. Finally, Judas says, it isn't me, is it, Rabbi? And remember, he is the only one who calls Jesus Rabbi instead of Lord. And Jesus said, you said so. So it's a yes. It's a yes. Every time that Jesus says, you said so, he's saying yes. So when the high priest says, are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God? And Jesus says, you said so. Believe it or not, there are some interpreters who don't know what that means. They say that Jesus is equivocating. It's neither yes nor no. Some have actually said it's no. You said so. I didn't say so. Or is it you said so? I mean, it's not it's not a yes answer. By ordinarily, and that's not how you say yes. You said so. Jesus says yes. It's not ambiguous, but he says it in this way. It's not neutral. It's a yes answer. We know this for certain because of the place where he uses it in response to Judas and later for Pilate. But the reason why we know it's a yes is because of what he follows up with it. Because if he had only said that, they would not have a reason to condemn him to death. But he says something afterwards that is much, much stronger. And this is what seals his fate, if you will. Because he doesn't just say, when Caiaphas says, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God?" If Jesus said, "You said so," that wouldn't be enough. Because it's not clearly a yes to most people. We know that that's how Jesus says yes, and it's more than yes, because he's saying, you said it, you know the truth, because those words came out of your mouth. So you know the truth. So it's Jesus's way of saying yes, but it might not be clear to everybody else. How do we know that it is absolutely a yes? Because of what he says after that. After the "you said so," he says, "But I say to you that from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." That is the key statement. That's the statement of divinity that they were hoping for. And this is what leads to his condemnation, because it is at that point that the high priest tears his robes and says he's guilty of blasphemy. So what did Jesus say that was so terrible? You will from now on, in other words, he's going to die, but he says from now on, you're going to see me. The Son of Man, Son of Man. Son of Man, by the way, is not the opposite of Son of God. It is not a statement of Jesus's humanity. When Jesus calls himself Son of Man, which was the most common way he referred to himself, it was not simply a way of referring to himself, but it was really a statement of his divinity. And he is hearkening here, or reminding us here, of the vision of Daniel in chapter 7, in which Daniel has a vision of one like the Son of Man, or the Son of Man. One like the Son of Man is in the book of Revelation. But in Daniel, there's a vision of the Son of Man, to whom God, the Ancient of Days, seated on a throne, gives all his authority to the Son of Man. This is an apocalyptic vision that Daniel has. And this is a way of saying, I'm the person that Daniel saw in his vision, in which he gave all of his authority. God gave all of his authority to this mysterious Son of Man person. So when Jesus calls himself Son of Man, even though it was a way that people kind of referred to human being, that's not how he means it. And everybody knows that, but they could never exactly pin him down on that he is really claiming divinity. And he doesn't just say, you will see the Son of Man. He says, sitting at the right hand of the power. And that was a euphemism for God. To this day, Jews do not use the word God. They don't refer to God directly out of great reverence for God. Instead, they'll say the Mighty One, the King of Israel, the name Hashem to refer to God. They'll say the Mighty One of Jacob. They'll have other ways to refer to God, but they don't ever say God. So here's something we see Jesus referring to God by calling him the power. You will see me seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And we see something a little bit different in Mark. It's the right hand of the Blessed One. That's another one. But sitting at the right hand was a very powerful and important biblical image. It comes from Psalm 110, verse 1, Gathimenon ekvexion. And we say that in the Creed even. That's a very important statement. He is seated at the right hand of the Father. And we don't really understand how powerful that statement is. To be seated at the right hand of means to co-rule, to have equal authority, to have complete authority, to co-reign. And so it's clear by saying, you will see me seated at the right hand, the Son of Man. He doesn't say me. You will see the Son of Man. They know we're talking about himself. Seated at the right hand of power, that's God, that he's claiming to be equal to God. So for the people who say Jesus never claimed to be God, it is on that basis, claiming that he is God, that he's co-equal to God the Father, that he is put to death, that he is sentenced to death. Because even that is not necessarily enough. He adds something else. In other words, everything Jesus adds to the statement makes him more guilty of blasphemy, we could put it that way, because he adds to that, and coming on the clouds of heaven. Something we've seen him reference before and is elsewhere in the scriptures. When he talks about coming, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power. All of that are statements of divinity. And coming on the clouds of heaven just is a stronger allusion to divinity, because the one who came on the clouds is always God. Okay, and we see this in the scriptures. The voice of God comes out of the cloud in the transfiguration. The Israelites are accompanied by a cloud as they wander through the desert after the Exodus. At the parousia, when Jesus describes how he's going to come in the second coming, he's coming on the clouds. St. Paul uses this. It's throughout the New Testament. So this is an image of divinity. So he has said exactly what they wanted him to say, something that will bring about the death penalty. And of course, the high priest tears his robes and pronounces blasphemy. But we're not quite done with our lesson tonight. We're going to continue after the break a little bit longer, because we have to talk about the proclamation of Jesus's guilt and Peter's denials. So join me after the break.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okie dokie, we're in Matthew chapter 26, and we are finishing up the trial of Jesus. Jesus has just given the high priest Caiaphas exactly what he wanted, a reason to condemn the Lord to death, but he doesn't do it because he's got a death wish or something like that. Certainly not. He says it so that there will be no disputing about who Christ is. No one can ever say that Jesus didn't reveal who he was to the Jewish leaders. They suspected that this is what he believed himself to be, the Messiah, and he gives them more than that. The Messiah and the Son of the living God. He admits it and adds to it without any question by alluding to the person whom Daniel saw in his vision, the Son of Man, who will be seated at the right hand of the power, that's God, and coming on the clouds of heaven. That's divinity. So he's more than the Messiah. He's the Son of God himself. He makes that abundantly clear. And because of this, Caiaphas stands up and tears his robes. So here is verse 65. Then the high priest tore his robes and says, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy." So, of course, this is a very dramatic scene. He stands up and tears his garments. Now, this was actually forbidden. The high priest was never to tear his garments. Once they were torn, they could not be mended. He had a seamless robe. This is not mentioned. The seamless robe is not mentioned in any of the Gospels, except John's Gospel, of course, where he sees in this an allusion to Christ being the high priest of heaven. But that's here, all we know is that the high priest tears his garments. Everybody knows that he cannot have any garment with a seam. He's not supposed to tear it, even upon hearing upon the death of his parents. He was never supposed to tear his robes, but he does that here. And that's another reason why it's especially shocking. So why does he tear his robes in this very dramatic fashion? And what Jesus said was probably dramatic enough. And Chrysostom recognizes the reason for the act. He says that he rent his clothes to add force to the accusation, to aggravate what the Lord said by the act. For what Jesus had said moved the hearers to fear. That's what St. John Chrysostom says, that he had maybe that they were moved to be afraid by what the Lord said. So Caiaphas tears his robes, and he definitely changes the subject and gets back to the idea of blasphemy and adds force, as he says, as Chrysostom says, to the accusation by tearing his robes and saying he has uttered blasphemy. What is your judgment? And they answered, he deserves death. Of course, blasphemy was probably the most serious crime of the Old Testament. It always carried the death penalty. It's kind of hard to know what would be considered rising to the level of blasphemy. By this time, they were much, much stricter in the Old Testament. They weren't allowed to say the name of God. If you said the name of God, that could be considered blasphemy in the early days of the Hebrews. But of course, there could be anything that seems to impinge upon the prerogatives of God. So remember that when Jesus had forgiven, like yesterday we had the gospel reading of the healing of the paralytic, and when secretly they're thinking, when Jesus says to the paralyzed man who was lowered down through the roof, your sins are forgiven, and secretly the people who are watching, the Pharisees who are watching, are thinking, oh, this is blasphemy because no one can forgive sins but God alone. So it can be not simply what you say about yourself, perhaps as Jesus did here, claiming to be God, but also what you do that sort of is something that is considered only possible to be done by God in terms of authority, asserting a kind of authority, which we see Jesus doing again and again and again, forgiving sins, saying, I am, the master of the Sabbath, the Son of Man is the master of the Sabbath. That term, Son of Man, Jesus used again and again whenever he spoke about his authority to forgive sins, authority to override the Sabbath regulations. He's the one who's going to come in judgment. When the Son of Man comes, he will separate the sheep from the goats. Every time you see that Son of Man language, it's an association with his authority or with his suffering. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests, and they will, etc. So here, the blasphemy is not just what you say about yourself, claiming divinity, as in here, but also sort of claiming authority that properly belongs to God, which we've seen Jesus do throughout the gospel. So St. John Chrysostom, I think, was really interesting that he notices that Caiaphas tears his robes and says that Jesus has committed blasphemy, and then he asks for their opinion. So notice, and as I think he's very politically observant here, that Chrysostom notices that he decides what the sentence is, and then he asks, oh, what's the sentence? Oh, what's the crime? So that he says that the behavior of the high priest was to encourage the certain response of the Sanhedrin, and he announced that Jesus had committed blasphemy before asking the members what their judgment was. And of course, their judgment is he deserves death. I think that's very smart of Chrysostom to notice that, but I think that any pious Jew who would have heard that kind of statement would have assumed that Jesus deserves death. They're certainly not going to believe that he's the Son of God. They certainly did. The disciples did, and later many believers did, but these people had a lot invested. That's why I spent a lot of time trying to explain to you about the temple and about the ruling elite in Jerusalem. They were unwilling to give up their power and their money and their prestige and their privileges that made life very nice for them. So they're certainly not about to believe that Jesus might really be the Son of God. So what is so ironic here is that the Lord is condemned to death for being who he really is, for acknowledging who he really is, for being the Messiah and the Son of God. And the same thing will happen, again, ironically, by Pilate. Pilate will condemn Jesus to death as King of the Jews because he really is the King of the Jews. So there's a tremendous irony here. But of course, our little scene doesn't end right there. Our scene ends with verses 67 and 68 of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26. Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is it that struck you?" So even though they arrested him and brought him there, now the beating begins. Now the physical abuse of Christ begins. And I think that there was a lot of animosity, pent-up frustration, and anger. I don't think they're just punishing him. I think there's a lot of personal animosity that comes at him. They're slapping him. They're kicking him. They're beating him. And there's this fury and frustration all comes out against him physically now. He is by himself. He's alone in the room with them. They can do whatever they want with him. Of course, they're mocking him and beating him. And they have such contempt for him, and they are really unable to restrain their anger and their rage and their contempt for him. We don't know how bad the beating was that he received, but definitely he was beaten. There's no doubt about that. That's what they would have done. Ordinarily, he might have been scourged or at least whipped. Might have been whipped, but I don't think they do that at this point because they already knew they were going to take him to Pilate in the morning, and they didn't want him to be all bloody. But that he got a beating, I think we can be pretty certain of that. So I want to read to you what St. Cyril of Alexandria said about this. And it's so beautiful during our services of Holy Week, how much the hymns of the church bring out this irony of the patience and meekness of the Lord, the forbearance of the Lord through all of this, that he allowed himself to be abused this way by his own creatures that he created. So here's St. Cyril of Alexandria from his commentary on Luke's Gospel. The Lord of heaven and earth, the creator and artificer of all, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, he who is of such surpassing greatness in glory and majesty, the foundation of everything, and that in which all things exist and abide, is scorned like one of us, and patiently endures the buffetings and submits to the ridicule of the wicked, offering himself to us as a perfect pattern of long-suffering, or rather manifesting the incomparable greatness of his godlike gentleness. Or perhaps he endures this to rebuke the infirmity of our minds, to show that the things of men fall as far below the divine excellencies as our nature is inferior to his. For we who are of earth, mere corruption and ashes, attack at once those who would mistreat us. But he who in nature and glory transcends the limits of our understanding and powers of speech, patiently endured those officers when they not merely mocked, but even struck him. So I think it's just so powerful when you think about what the Lord endured and how he gave us this example. And you know, one of the things that the Romans would say, and even Jews would say, if God was really to become man, he would be a king. He certainly wouldn't die on a cross, but instead the reality is that he came as a servant and died for us and allowed himself to be mistreated for us to give us an example of what it is to be God. And God is not there to be master over us, to order us around, to serve him, but so that we could become like him, to learn to be patient like him, to serve others, and everything else. It's quite extraordinary. So it's because of this that we have this understanding of who God is. It's because we know Jesus Christ. And that's why for Jews and for Muslims, they have a different understanding of God. Our understanding of who God is based on who Christ is. And so this is why he came, to give us himself as a model. So let's take a look at Peter's denials with the time that we have remaining. So what was happening in the meantime? He was sitting outside in the courtyard, and we heard the first accusation. This is back that he comes into the courtyard to see what's going to happen. And here in 69, we have the first charge that he is a follower of Jesus. Verse 69, chapter 26 of Matthew's Gospel. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a maid came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all and said, "I do not know what you mean." In verse 71, and when he went out to the porch, another maid saw him and said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up to Peter and said, "Certainly you were one of them, for your accent betrays you." They spoke with an accent from Galilee. Then he began to invoke a curse upon himself and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. You kind of want to give him a hug right there, right? How distressing was that? Remember, of course, he was the one who had said, "Everybody else will deny you, but I never will." And he set himself up for this very great fall. And there's so much that we could say about this, that he was first sort of confronted, but not in an aggressive way, simply as an observation by a maid. And that means a girl, not a woman, but a girl, a servant girl. And Peter kind of crumbles, becomes frightened by this question by this girl. "You were with Jesus from Galilee, right?" "Oh, I don't know." And then he kind of moves away, and somebody else says to him, "Oh, you were with him." "No, I don't know him." But each time the denials become stronger. First he just denies it, then he denies it with an oath, and then he begins calling down curses upon himself, which is pretty dramatic, that he does not know the Lord. And of course, it is after this third time that the cock crows. Now, this is a little strange for us because this is the middle of the night, but actually, roosters do crow even in the middle of the night. For those of you who live in cities like I do, sometimes you do not realize that roosters don't just crow in the morning when the sun comes up. And actually, there are actual articles written about roosters crowing in Jerusalem, and people used to mark time in the night by the cock's crow. And it's at a certain time of night, and it's actually around 1:30 in the morning. Believe it or not, there are articles that are written about this, about the punctuality of roosters crowing in Jerusalem. So this may have been, I think it would have been a little bit later than this. I don't think they could have finished all of this at 1:30, by 1:30 in the morning, but I guess it's possible. I'm not going to interfere with the question or get involved in the question of what hour the cocks actually crowed. But when he says when the cock crows, he doesn't mean that there's just one rooster in all of Jerusalem. But at that time, they would begin to crow. And then, of course, they're going to crow again later in the night and in the morning. And by the way, it's so interesting because, of course, he's devastated. Peter is devastated by his denial of Jesus. He was very proud of himself, that the fact that others will deny you, I never will. I will die with you. Everybody else said it too, but he places himself higher than the rest of the disciples by saying, they might deny you, but I never will, which is why we mentioned last time, the Lord allows his fall to teach him a lesson, never to rely upon himself. And it was a humbling moment something that was never forgotten by the church. And it's more than simple disloyalty. Like we think when we have a friend who doesn't stand with us, we think, oh, they're not a loyal friend. But this is more than that. He who denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. That's actually in this very gospel, Matthew chapter 10, verse 33. So there are so many lessons we can learn from Peter's denial. And St. Cyril of Alexandria talks about that. But before I read you what St. Cyril says, as we close out our program tonight, I want to tell you that Father Costa spent some months in the city of Paphos in Cyprus, where he was serving a church there, Agia Nargiri, in the city of Paphos. It's one of the larger cities in Cyprus on the southern part of the island. And he talked to me about how people have roosters. You can't have roosters in a city in the United States. There are laws against that because obviously they would disturb people. I used to have a pet rooster, and I acquired it from my cousin. My cousin had a rooster, believe it or not, in Culver City in Los Angeles. And of course, the neighbors complained about it. We happened to live in a rural area at the time. And so this rooster came to live with us, and he became my pet. But you can't ordinarily have roosters in cities, but they do apparently in Paphos, because when Father Costa was spending some time there, they would wake him up in the middle of the night, and they would crow in the middle of the night. And of course, he was often thinking about St. Peter, because roosters were common even in cities back then. And imagine what it was like for St. Peter for the rest of his life. Every time he heard a rooster crow, especially at night, did it remind him of the fact that he had at one time denied the Lord? I think so. So at any rate, here is St. Cyril of Alexandria talking about the lesson that St. Peter learned from this experience of denying the Lord. We don't say that Peter betrayed the Lord. That's what we say about Judas. We say that he denied the Lord. So here's St. Cyril of Alexandria in his commentary on Luke. It is worth our while observing in what way his sin was forgiven and how he put away his fault. For the event might prove no slight benefit to us also. He did not, therefore, defer his repentance, nor was he careless about it. For as rapid as his descent was into sin, so quick were his tears because of it. Nor did he merely weep, but wept bitterly. If temptation assails us, and we prove weak, let us weep bitterly. Let us ask forgiveness of God, for he heals those who are contrite. He raises up the fallen. He stretches out his saving hand to those who have gone astray, for he is the Savior of all. And we know that the Lord forgave Peter. We know that he actually appeared to Peter, one of the first people to whom he appears. That is referenced in the Gospel of Luke. After the men who are on the road to Emmaus return to Jerusalem, they say he has appeared to Simon. So we know that he forgave him, but he also forgives him on a more personal level. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 21, when he says they're at the lake shore, and Jesus asked Peter, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. And that's a direct reference to Peter's insistence that he would never deny Jesus because he loved him more than those others. Those others, they may deny you, but I never will. So he says, Peter, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Peter, do you love me? And Peter, yes, dear Lord, you know I love you. He asks him 3 times. And then says, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, after each one. Now, this is the basis for the Catholic Church saying that Peter is responsible for the entire church, and the papacy is supposed to be over the entire church, the Bishop of Rome. In the early church, this was never interpreted this way. And we know this from the sermons of St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine. They never took this as authority over the entire church. But instead, what is he doing there? The Lord was reinstating Peter, who still felt rather bashful, still felt rather shy, still felt rather ashamed of the fact that he had denied the Lord, but the Lord is reassuring him and restoring him as a disciple by saying, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. That's what he is doing there. And that's what all the early interpreters of the scriptures say is going on there. He's not putting Peter in charge of the entire church. So, but of course, Peter would never forget the lesson of that night. And St. Cyril of Alexandria reminds us that stories like these, and so did John Chrysostom, and all the saints remind us that stories like these in the scriptures of the mistakes that people make, of the sins that people commit, of somebody like St. Paul, who begins, we first are introduced to St. Paul as Saul of Tarsus, who's persecuting the church. We don't have perfect people in the Bible except for Jesus Christ. Everybody else is fallen. Everybody else makes mistakes. They have shortcomings. And the stories of having them in the Bible are there to teach us that if we fall, we should not despair, but we should rise again. We should repent and return to the Lord in repentance, and the Lord will forgive us. So Peter repented and was forgiven by the Lord, but Judas only experienced remorse. And because he only had remorse, he ends up committing suicide. So next week, we are going to discuss the suicide of Judas, the Roman trial before Pilate. Judas, of course, tries to return the money. There's a whole reason why he does that. Everything is explained in my book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. But there's a reason why he tries to return the money to the temple. And of course, he commits suicide. We have the Roman trial before Pilate. We'll talk about Pilate himself as a historical figure, what became of him, who he was. So don't miss it next week right here on Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. You've been listening to Search the Scriptures Live, a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace, according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all nations, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Good night.
Depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, O